would you do if the tiny faces you tuck in every night suddenly carried a secret that could shatter everything you believe about love and loyalty? Laura thought her perfect family was unbreakable until a hidden DNA test on her twins unearthed a truth that could rip her marriage apart. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. The smell of cinnamon pancakes drifted through the kitchen as Laura Montgomery flipped the last one onto a plate, her wrist moving with a practiced rhythm that masked the churning inside her chest. It was Saturday morning, and sunlight streamed in through the bay window of their suburban Chicago home, casting long golden bars across the tile floor and glinting off the silver edges of the toaster. Her twin boys, Mason and Caleb, were doubled over in laughter at the kitchen table, a comic book splayed out between them, their identical cowlicks springing in opposite directions like mischievous little flags. Their voices rose and fell in that effortless cadence only twins shared, arguing whether the villain or the hero had the better suit, totally oblivious to the storm gathering behind their mother's eyes. Across from them, her husband Jason sat in his usual spot, coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, nodding absently and issuing occasional mm-hms, barely passed for engagement. His screen glowed with unread emails. Headline, something that always seemed more important than the present moment. To anyone else, it would have looked like the American dream in motion. Bright children, warm food, a cozy house, and a quiet neighborhood. But Laura's hands trembled as she poured the syrup, a telltale shake she tried to cover with a half-hearted smile. For weeks now, maybe longer, something had been wrong. Not in the kind of way you could easily explain or even detect from the outside, but in the way a house settles strangely at night when the foundation has begun to crack. It wasn't just Jason's late nights or the vague reasons behind his business trips. It was the emotional gap, the hollow space where intimacy had once lived. Their conversations had turned mechanical, their touch perfunctory, and somewhere along the way, his eyes stopped lighting up when she walked into the room. And then there were the boys. Laura had always prided herself on knowing them instinctively, distinguishing their cries as infants, predicting their moods, feeling tethered to them with something deeper than logic. But lately, a series of small, nagging details had wormed their way into her awareness. Mason had her chin, her smile, even her temper. But Caleb had features that didn't quite fit. His laugh sounded foreign, like a song she couldn't place. His eyes were lighter, his gait slightly different, his dimple positioned in a way that never matched Mason's, even accounting for the natural variance between twins. Laura had brushed these thoughts aside every time they rose, slapping them down with the ferocity of someone afraid of where they might lead. She reminded herself that genetics were funny, that kids didn't always look exactly like their parents. But it wasn't just appearance. It was intuition. There were moments when she would watch Caleb and feel a jolt of something she couldn't name, a flicker of uncertainty, like looking into a mirror that warped her reflection. It made her feel monstrous, questioning her own child. And yet, as she lay awake at night while the rest of the house exhaled in sleep, those questions chewed at her. What if there had been a mistake, something from her past she'd buried so deep it only surfaced in fragments? There had been that one night, years ago, during a dark patch in her marriage, when the boundaries had blurred and grief had driven her into a fog of poor choices. She had tried so hard to forget it, to seal it away under layers of routine and forgiveness. But secrets had a way of fermenting in the dark. As she watched Jason now, still scrolling through his phone, his face a blank canvas, she realized how much she had been pretending that things were fine, that the weight in her chest was just stress, that the gnawing sense of something being wrong was just her imagination. But imagination didn't make your hands shake at breakfast. Imagination didn't make your stomach drop when your son smiled and you couldn't recognize yourself in him. Imagination didn't keep you up at night, retracing timelines and doing math you never thought you'd need. As she set the syrup down and heard the clink of glass on ceramic, she caught her own reflection in the kitchen window. A woman still young, but tired, carrying too many truths in her eyes. Caleb looked up at her then, grinning, syrup smeared on his cheek. "Mama, look!" he giggled, pointing to a drawing in the comic book. His voice was high and sweet, filled with trust. Laura's chest clenched. She smiled back, but it felt like wearing someone else's face. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but from something sharper, resolve. She knew, in that moment, that she couldn't keep pretending. The need to know had overtaken the fear of what knowing might mean. She couldn't spend the rest of her life questioning the very foundation of her family. She would take the test, quietly, privately, without involving Jason or the boys. Not yet. Just something to silence the voices in her head, to either bury the doubt for good or finally face it. As she reached out to wipe the syrup from Caleb's cheek, her hand lingered a moment longer than usual. He beamed up at her, and she nodded, murmuring, "Eat up, baby. They're still warm." Her voice was gentle, but inside her a storm had broken open. She sat down beside them, joining the laughter, flipping pages, pretending just a little longer. But something had shifted, and no amount of syrup or sunshine could sweeten the truth that was barreling toward her like a freight train with no brakes. Laura waited until the boys were at school and Jason had left for another last-minute meeting, his kiss on her cheek so perfunctory it may as well have been a breeze passing by. The house fell quiet in his absence, and the silence echoed too loudly through the walls. She sat at the kitchen table, her fingers curled tightly around a cup of lukewarm coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at the DNA kit lying unopened before her like some forbidden relic, small, unassuming, but carrying the weight of every doubt, every whisper her heart had tried to silence. She reached for it once, then drew her hand back like it might burn her. What if this was all in her head? What if she opened this door and found it led to nothing but more pain? Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she nearly got up and tossed the whole thing into the trash, burying it beneath coffee grounds and crushed cereal boxes. But she didn't, because that splinter in her heart, the one she'd tried to ignore for weeks, throbbed with a kind of painful urgency that refused to be dismissed. Sometimes, she realized, the truth was the only way out of the dark, no matter how terrifying its shape. Her hands shook as she peeled back the packaging, each layer crackling like thunder in the stillness. She filled out the paperwork slowly, deliberately, like a woman signing her own name on a document she didn't want to read. Her handwriting wobbled, betraying the storm inside her chest. When it came time to swab Mason's cheek, her hand trembled so much she had to steady it against the edge of the counter. He had laughed that morning about a dream where he turned into a dragon, his eyes bright, his smile careless. She thought of that smile now as she completed his swab and then moved on to Caleb, her sweet, observant Caleb, who always noticed when she was sad but never pushed too hard. He'd hugged her before leaving for school, his arms wrapped tight around her waist like he knew she needed grounding. She whispered an apology as she took his sample, even though he wasn't there to hear it. The guilt rolled through her like thunderclouds gathering over the lake, thick and suffocating. She sealed the samples with trembling fingers, pressed the envelope closed, and stared at it for nearly an hour. Her reflection in the stainless steel toaster across from her looked like a ghost, eyes wide, lips pressed together in a desperate line. When she finally stood and walked it out to the mailbox, every step felt heavier than the last. Her hand hovered above the slot, the envelope held like a blade between her fingers. One drop, one decision, and everything could change. She closed her eyes, whispered a silent prayer, though she wasn't sure what for, and let it fall. The sound it made was deceptively soft, but in her heart it echoed like an earthquake. There was no going back now. That night, as the boys chattered about their day and Jason answered emails during dinner, Laura sat in stunned silence, barely tasting her food, nodding and smiling on autopilot. Over the next 2 weeks, she lived in a strange, suspended reality. Time both dragged and blurred. She dropped the boys at school, volunteered at the library, cooked meals, attended PTA meetings, but all of it felt like a play she was starring in, her real self trapped behind the curtain. Every mundane act was painted over with anxiety. At the grocery store, she stared too long at twins in the cereal aisle, wondering how other mothers just knew, just trusted. At night, she curled into herself while Jason lay beside her, oblivious, the warmth of his body doing nothing to soothe the cold that had crept into her bones. She couldn't bring herself to tell him. Not yet. What would she say? "I tested our sons behind your back because I couldn't ignore the ghost of a mistake I can barely remember." She rehearsed it in her mind 100 different ways, but none of them ended with his forgiveness. In those long, torturous nights, she would stare up at the ceiling and imagine worst-case scenarios like they were lullabies. She pictured Jason's face, twisted in betrayal, her boys asking questions she couldn't answer, the crumbling of everything she'd built, one shattered piece at a time. Sometimes she thought about calling her sister just to confess to someone, but the words stuck in her throat. She had made this decision alone, and now she had to live in the vacuum of its consequences. The mornings were the hardest, when sunlight made the world look deceptively clean and simple. Caleb would wrap his arms around her waist, Mason would tell a joke that didn't make sense, and Jason would kiss her cheek without ever meeting her eyes, and she'd wonder how much longer she could keep pretending she was okay. How long she could wear this mask before it cracked down the middle. Each day was a balancing act on a wire stretched over fire, and the wind was picking up. She told herself she did it for the truth. She told herself mothers were allowed to need answers, but underneath it all, she feared that what she really wanted was punishment, a reckoning, because some part of her had never forgiven herself for that night all those years ago, the night she thought had been buried for good. Now, every ticking second brought her closer to its resurrection, and when the results finally arrived, she knew before even opening them that her life would never be the same again. The results arrived on a Thursday. It was raining, the sky bruised purple and gray as Laura pulled the envelope from the mailbox, the paper already slightly damp from the mist in the air. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, and for a brief second she considered turning around, going back inside, pretending she hadn't seen it, that small, unassuming envelope that suddenly weighed more than her entire body. But something propelled her forward, some force inside her too heavy to ignore. Her hands trembled violently as she tore it open right there on the porch, barely noticing the cold rain slipping past the collar of her sweater or the way her knees bent slightly, like her body already sensed what her mind hadn't yet processed. Her heart roared in her ears like an oncoming train, drowning out the soft patter of rain on the roof. The words appeared slowly, like a nightmare developing in stages. Mason Montgomery, no match to Jason Montgomery. Caleb Montgomery, no match to Jason Montgomery. The font was sterile, mechanical, like it had been typed by a machine that didn't care it was dismantling someone's life. She blinked hard, then read it again and again and again, as if repetition would force the meaning to shift, but it didn't. Each reading only carved the truth deeper into her chest. Jason wasn't their biological father, not Mason, not Caleb, not either of them. It wasn't just one child, it was both. The paper slipped from her fingers and fluttered in her lap like a dying bird, and she sat heavily on the porch steps, knees folding like paper under the unbearable weight of the moment. Her jeans absorbed the rainwater that pooled on the steps, but she didn't move, couldn't. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her entire world narrowed down to the size of a jagged hole inside her rib. She stared at the lawn without seeing it, the blurred shapes of hydrangeas bending under the rain, the neighbors' wind chimes dancing out a song she would never hear again the same way. Her thoughts spiraled fast and vicious. Jason wasn't the father. Then who was? The memory broke free from its long-buried vault like a scream in the dark. That night, years ago, when everything between her and Jason had been unraveling, they'd fought about something she couldn't even remember now. Bills, the house, how distant they'd both become. He'd left for a few days to stay with his brother, and she had gone to her college reunion alone, wearing her loneliness like a second skin. She remembered the hotel bar, the bittersweet nostalgia, the too strong drinks. She remembered laughing too loud, her skin prickling from attention, the music dulling her good sense. A stranger's warm smile, the way he looked at her like she wasn't invisible, a blur of hands and mouths and choices she never meant to make. She had woken up the next morning in a fog of shame, dressing quickly and fleeing without a goodbye. She had sworn to herself it would never happen again, that it didn't mean anything, that it would stay buried forever. She had come home to Jason, who had returned the same day, apologetic, wanting to try again, and they had. She never told him, not because she didn't want to, because she couldn't. The weight of that night had become a sealed box she shoved into the deepest part of her memory, one she refused to open even when the boys were born just 8 months later. She'd convinced herself the timeline worked, convinced herself they were Jason's. Her heart had wanted them to be his. Now, the truth tore through her carefully constructed denial like a blade. The rain came harder, mixing with the hot tears that rolled down her face. She pressed her fist to her mouth to keep from screaming, the pain so raw it felt physical. She had broken everything, not just her own life, but Jason, her boys. They had lived under a lie, a beautiful lie, one she had nurtured and protected until it consumed her. How could she look Jason in the eye? How could she tell her children? Would Jason hate them for not being his? Would he leave them? Leave her? Would they see her differently? Would they ever trust her again? Her stomach turned violently at the thought. She doubled over, elbows on her thighs, forehead pressed to her damp fists, trying to breathe through the horror of what she had unleashed. She was a mother, and mothers were supposed to protect their children. Instead, she had betrayed them without them even knowing. She'd built their lives on a fault line, and now the quake had come. The paper lay face up beside her, mocking her with its cold, final truth. The rain continued to fall, relentless, like the universe weeping with her. But even as she sat there unraveling, another thought began to creep in. Quiet, dangerous. What if she said nothing? What if she burned the results and locked the truth away again? Could she pretend she never saw it? Could she carry this alone to spare them? She shook her head, horrified by the thought, but also deeply, terrifyingly tempted. Because the alternative, the honesty, the confession, the fallout, seemed too big for her to survive. And yet, even as she considered the escape, she knew in her bones she wouldn't take it. The truth was out now. It had shape and weight and permanence, and it would demand to be reckoned with. She was no longer the same woman who had dropped the envelope into the mailbox weeks ago, that Laura had clung to hope. Laura sat soaked and shaking on the porch, staring down the wreckage of everything she loved. She had been blind. She had been reckless. And now, somehow, she would have to find a way to live with the cost. When Jason came home late that night, Laura sat waiting at the kitchen table, the DNA results face down before her like a loaded weapon she had no idea how to disarm. The lights were dimmed low, casting long shadows on the walls, and the only sound in the house was the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old wall clock above the sink. Her heart was a relentless drumbeat in her chest, loud enough that she was sure he would hear it the moment he walked in. When the front door finally creaked open, Laura stiffened, her breath catching. Jason stepped in, shaking rain from his coat, his hair damp and curling slightly at the ends. He looked tired, his shoulders slumped in a way that suggested more than just jet lag. He dropped his bag by the door and walked into the kitchen, his phone still in hand, thumbing through emails or messages or some other distraction. He leaned down and kissed her cheek absent-mindedly, his lips brushing against her skin without warmth. "Flight got delayed," he muttered, setting his phone down beside the fruit bowl, not yet noticing her stiff posture, the way her fingers gripped the edge of the table like it was the only thing anchoring her to reality. For the briefest moment, Laura considered hiding the envelope, tearing the papers into tiny, irretrievable pieces, burying the truth beneath the floorboards of their life like a secret corpse she could pretend never existed. If she kept silent, maybe they could continue like nothing had happened. Maybe the boys would never know. Maybe Jason would never look at them differently. But then Mason's laughter drifted down from upstairs, bright and pure, the kind of sound that wrapped around her heart like a ribbon, and in that instant, she knew she couldn't do it. She couldn't live with this lie rotting inside her. Slowly, almost mechanically, she reached for the envelope and slid it across the table to him. Jason glanced at it, then at her, frowning slightly as he picked it up and flipped it over. He read the heading, then the first few lines. His eyes widened, the lines in his forehead deepening with each passing second. The air between them thickened, so heavy Laura could hardly breathe. He looked up, his face a mask of disbelief, pain flickering across his features like lightning behind a storm cloud. "What is this?" he asked, his voice low and tight, like a rope pulled too far. Laura's mouth opened, nothing came out. The words tangled in her throat, choking her. Her betrayal was no longer an abstract fear. It was a presence in the room, tangible and suffocating, stretching its limbs across the space they once called home. Jason stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the tile with a shrill screech that made her flinch. He held the paper like it was toxic, like it might burn his fingers. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice louder now, anger barely contained beneath the surface. Laura shook her head, tears already blurring her vision. "I don't know," she whispered. It was a mistake, a long time ago, before we got back together." Her voice trembled with the weight of years compressed into one awful truth. Jason's face twisted, his mouth opening in disbelief. "A mistake?" he repeated, his voice cracking mid-sentence. "Laura, they're my sons. I raised them. I was there for every fever, every scraped knee, every birthday. I stayed up with them when they had nightmares. I taught them how to ride their bikes. His voice broke completely and he turned away, walking a few steps toward the counter before stopping, his back to her, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. Laura stood, instinctively reaching out for him, but the moment her fingers brushed his arm, he recoiled like she'd set fire to his skin. "Don't," he said, his voice strangled. "Don't touch me right now." She let her hand drop, the ache of rejection spreading through her like a slow poison. "I never meant to lie," she said softly. "I didn't even know. I thought they were yours. I wanted them to be yours. I told myself—" "You told yourself what?" he cut in, spinning around to face her, eyes wet with fury. "That it didn't matter? That I'd never find out? That you could live with it forever?" His voice rose with each question, and Laura could see the devastation behind his anger, the shattering of trust in real time. She took a step back, stunned by the intensity of his pain, her own shame threatening to swallow her whole. "I was scared," she said. "I was stupid. I made a horrible mistake and I didn't know how to fix it." Jason stared at her, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling like a man barely keeping afloat. "You broke us," he said finally, the words landing like a verdict. "You broke everything." The finality of it sliced through her, and for a moment all she could do was nod, tears streaming silently down her face. Jason looked at the papers again, as if hoping the words would change, rewrite themselves into a lie that felt safer. But they didn't. They never would. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, grabbing his coat with trembling hands. "Jason, please," she whispered, but he didn't stop. He didn't even look back. The door slammed behind him with such force the walls seemed to tremble, and the sound echoed through the house like a gunshot. Laura stood there, motionless, the silence afterward deafening. Upstairs, the boys were still laughing, unaware that their world had just changed forever. She sank slowly into the chair, the one Jason had vacated just moments before, and stared at the DNA results lying open on the table, the ink blurred beneath her tears. She had feared this moment for so long, and now that it had come, it was worse than she could have imagined. The man she loved was gone. The father her sons adored had been gutted by a truth she couldn't undo, and she was left in the ruins, surrounded by the ghosts of the life they once shared, wondering if anything could ever be whole again. The days that followed bled together in a haze of grief and guilt, the hours indistinguishable from one another, each one stitched to the next with quiet suffering and silent question. Jason had packed a single overnight bag the night he left, but he didn't come back the next day, or the next. Instead, she received a single text. "I'm staying at the Wyndham. I need time." No anger, no accusations, just cold distance. She stared at the message for hours, rereading it like it might change, hoping the three little dots would appear and offer her some shred of hope, but they never did. Jason moved into that hotel, and his absence hit the house like a winter wind, creeping into every corner, chilling everything it touched. Laura found herself drifting through the routines of their lives with robotic precision, pouring orange juice, making peanut butter sandwiches, tying shoelaces, but none of it felt real. The boys asked where Daddy was, and she lied, through clenched teeth and tear-bright eyes, telling them he was on a long business trip, using the same tone she used when telling them Santa was real. The guilt clawed at her every time she saw their little faces light up with hope, every time Mason asked when he'd be back, or Caleb whispered, "I miss him," into her shoulder at bedtime. She smiled for them. She cooked their favorite meals, mac and cheese with hot dogs cut into stars, pancakes shaped like animals, chocolate chip cookies still warm from the oven. But inside, she was hollowed out, a shell walking through the motions of motherhood with a heart too broken to beat properly. Every time Mason grinned, something inside her cracked a little more, and every time Caleb hugged her, the weight of her secret pressed down harder, like a hand around her throat. She thought about telling them the truth more than once. She stood outside their bedroom door in the quiet hours, rehearsing the words in her mind, but they never sounded right. How could she burden them with the sins of the past? How could she look into their innocent eyes and unravel the foundation of their entire world? How could she make them question the only father they had ever known, the man who taught them to tie their shoes and told them bedtime stories and stayed up with them through the flu and nightmares? She couldn't do it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Meanwhile, Jason's absence echoed louder each day. It wasn't just the empty chair at dinner or the lack of his shoes by the door. It was the way the house felt off balance, like something crucial had been knocked out of alignment. The boys felt it too. At first they were just confused, asking questions, looking out the window whenever a car pulled into the driveway, but confusion soon turned to restlessness. Mason, usually the more energetic and impulsive one, became defiant, talking back to his teacher, refusing to eat his lunch, getting into a fight on the playground. Laura was called into the principal's office twice that week and had to force herself not to cry as she sat across from the stern-faced administrator, nodding and apologizing while Mason stared sullenly at the floor. Caleb, on the other hand, grew quieter. He started waking up in the middle of the night, crawling into her bed without a word. His little body pressed so tightly against hers she could feel the rhythm of his heartbeat. Some nights, he cried softly into her chest, whispering that he missed Daddy, that he didn't understand why he didn't come home anymore. Laura held him close, stroking his hair, whispering reassurances she didn't believe. "He'll be back soon," she would say. "He loves you so much." And in the dark, she'd bite her lip so hard she tasted blood, trying not to break down completely. The house grew heavier with each passing day, the weight of unanswered questions and invisible cracks threatening to bring the whole structure down. Laura found herself snapping at the boys over small things, losing patience with their messes, their noise, their questions, and every time she did, guilt swallowed her whole. She was failing them, failing all of them. She felt like she was drowning, struggling to keep all their heads above water when she could barely stay afloat herself. The nights were the worst. After the boys finally fell asleep, after the dishes were done and the toys were picked up, she would sit alone in the living room, staring at the television without seeing it, wrapped in a blanket that didn't keep out the cold. She'd scroll through old pictures on her phone, birthdays, vacations, family dinners, trying to find the moment where it all went wrong, the fork in the road she should have taken. Jason hadn't called, hadn't texted again, and worst of all, she didn't know if he ever would. She didn't know if he would ever walk through the front door again, drop his bag by the stairs, and kiss her forehead like he used to. And she didn't know if she even deserved for him to. She had broken something sacred, something built over years of shared life, and now she was trying to keep it all together with duct tape and lies. The boys were slipping through her fingers. Jason was disappearing into the space between hotel rooms and unanswered calls. And Laura was losing herself entirely, piece by piece, buried under the unbearable weight of what she had done. On a Sunday afternoon, nearly 3 weeks after the explosion that had torn their lives apart, Jason showed up at the house unannounced. His sudden presence a shock to Laura's system, like stepping into cold water without warning. She had been folding laundry in the living room when she heard the knock. Not the quick, familiar knock he used to use, but a heavy, uncertain one that made her heart stutter in her chest. She rushed to the door, hands trembling, and when she pulled it open, she found him standing there, rain dripping from his hair, his clothes damp and clinging to his frame, a battered duffel bag slung over one shoulder. He looked exhausted, his face drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper, the easy warmth he used to carry drained away, leaving something hollow and wary in its place. He didn't say a word as he stepped inside, the threshold between them feeling both impossibly wide and heartbreakingly thin. For a moment, Laura simply stared at him, unable to move, afraid that if she blinked, he would vanish like a dream. The sound of hurried footsteps broke the moment as Mason and Caleb came barreling down the stairs, their faces lighting up with pure, unfiltered joy at the sight of their father. "Daddy!" they shouted in unison, their small bodies colliding with his legs. Jason dropped the bag without a second thought and fell to his knees, gathering them into his arms, his face buried in their hair as he held them so tightly it looked almost painful. Laura's chest ached at the sight, a mix of relief and devastation twisting inside her. She wanted to rush to him, too, to bury her face in his neck and breathe him in, but she stayed rooted to the floor, her hands twisting the hem of her sweater. She wasn't sure she had the right to touch him anymore. Later, after the boys had been tucked into bed with promises that Daddy wasn't going anywhere tonight, Laura and Jason found themselves sitting across from each other in the dimly lit living room, the space between them heavy with everything left unsaid. Jason sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together, like a man trying to hold himself in one piece. The rain tapped a soft, relentless rhythm against the window, a muted percussion that seemed to underscore the fragile quiet between them. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unfamiliar, and when he spoke his voice was low and careful, each word chosen as if he were picking his way through a minefield. "I've been thinking," he said, staring down at his hands for a long moment before looking up at her. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion, and something else, something rawer. "I'm angry. I'm hurt. God, Laura, I don't even know what to do with all of it sometimes." Laura's throat tightened, and she pressed a hand against her mouth, terrified to say anything, terrified to break whatever fragile step he was trying to take toward her. He raked a hand through his damp hair, letting out a shaky breath. "But they're still my sons." His voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Laura's vision blurred with tears she couldn't hold back. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, her whole body aching with the enormity of the moment. Jason's gaze dropped back to his hands. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he said, and each syllable was like a nail driven into her heart. "I don't know if we'll make it. I don't even know if I want to try some days." Laura's breath hitched, and she wanted to fall to her knees to beg for forgiveness she wasn't sure she deserved. But then he looked up again, and for the first time in weeks there was something soft in his gaze. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the ghost of the love they had once shared. Battered and bleeding, but still alive. "But I'm not abandoning them," he said, his voice firmer now. "And I'm not abandoning you. Not yet." Laura's sob burst free, raw and shuddering, and she covered her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking as she tried to contain the sound. Jason hesitated for a long moment, then moved to sit beside her on the couch, tentative, as if afraid the slightest wrong move might send them both spiraling apart. He didn't touch her. He just sat there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, a silent offering of something not quite forgiveness, but maybe the beginning of it. They sat like that for a long time, listening to the rain tapping gently against the windows, two broken people stitched together by grief and guilt, and a love that refused to fully die. Laura wiped at her tears with trembling fingers, daring to glance at him out of the corner of her eye. He looked straight ahead, jaw tight, eyes distant, but he hadn't moved away. And somehow that tiny act, that choice to stay seated beside her when he could have walked away, felt like the bravest, kindest thing anyone had ever done. She wanted to reach out, to take his hand, but she didn't. She knew better than to rush him. Healing would come slowly, if it came at all. For now, she would sit with him in the wreckage they had created together, breathing in the heavy, wet air, hoping against hope that this fragile, broken beginning would be enough, that somehow, someday, they could find their way back to each other. But for tonight, the only thing that mattered was that he was here, that he hadn't given up, not yet. And for the first time in weeks, a tiny flicker of hope sparked to life in the darkness. The months that followed were brutal, but healing in small, stubborn ways, like tiny shoots pushing up through cracked, frozen earth after a long, merciless winter. Laura and Jason didn't wake up one morning and find things magically fixed. There were no grand apologies that erased the pain, no cinematic reunions where everything suddenly made sense. Instead, it was a slow, grueling process that tested them both more deeply than anything had before. They started therapy, first separately, because the wounds were too raw, too jagged to risk inflicting further damage by sitting side by side in those early sessions. Laura sat alone in a too-bright room with a woman whose gentle voice and probing questions forced her to unearth every buried guilt, every hidden shame she had locked away for years. There were sessions where Laura sobbed so hard she couldn't speak, where she left clutching a wad of tissues in her shaking hands, feeling like she had been flayed open. Jason had his own path, one Laura wasn't privy to, but she saw it in the hard set of his shoulders when he came home from his session, the way he avoided her eyes some days, the way he seemed lost in a battle only he could fight. Eventually, cautiously, they started attending sessions together, sitting on opposite ends of a beige couch with enough space between them to fit all the pain and anger that still lingered. Some sessions were brutal. There were days Jason couldn't even look at her, days when his words were sharp enough to leave invisible scars, when Laura wanted to crawl out of her own skin with the shame of it all. But there were also moments, tiny, glimmering moments, where they laughed through tears, remembering the good times, the real times, the moments before everything had gotten so tangled. They talked about the early days, Jason burning pancakes on their first morning in their new house, Laura forgetting their anniversary one year because she was so overwhelmed with the twins, and how Jason had shown up at her work with a cupcake and a grin instead of anger. They remembered how fiercely they had loved each other once, and those memories became lifelines they clung to when the present felt too broken to bear. Slowly, painfully, they built something new from the wreckage. not trying to recreate what they had lost, but forging something different, something messier, more honest. They learned each other's scars anew, learned how to sit with the discomfort instead of fleeing from it. Laura learned to forgive herself, not in a sweeping dramatic moment, but in tiny decisions every day, choosing not to punish herself with self-hatred, choosing to believe that one terrible mistake didn't erase the years of love and devotion she had poured into her marriage and her family. She learned that redemption wasn't something you earned once, it was something you worked toward every single day. Jason, too, grew in ways Laura had never imagined. He learned that being a father wasn't about biology or bloodlines, it was about choice, about presence, about showing up even when it hurt, even when the ground shifted beneath his feet. He learned that the bonds he had with Mason and Caleb were not fragile threads that could be cut by a DNA test. They were forged in sleepless nights and scraped knees and endless I love yous. They learned to choose each other again and again, not because it was easy, but because it was worth it. At first, the choosing felt like a battle, a daily, uphill climb against resentment and fear. But slowly, over countless small moments, shared dinners where laughter slowly returned, long walks where silence no longer felt suffocating, whispered apologies in the dark, the choosing began to feel like a homecoming, like breathing, like something they were meant to do all along. It wasn't perfect. It would never be perfect. They both carried the scars of what had happened, and some days those scars ached with old pain. But there was beauty in the imperfection, in the decision to stay, to fight, to forgive. There was beauty in the way Jason reached for her hand during therapy sessions without being asked, in the way Laura kissed his forehead when he fell asleep on the couch after a long day. There was beauty in the way they stumbled through hard conversations and still found themselves laughing at the boys' terrible jokes at the dinner table. Their love was no longer the naive, invincible thing it had once been. It was a battered, stubborn, fiercely resilient love, built not on the illusion of perfection but on the hard-won truth of who they were and who they were becoming. It was real, and it was enough. One evening, about a year after the DNA results had detonated their lives and forced them to rebuild from ashes, Laura found herself cleaning out the attic, dust motes swirling in the golden beam of her flashlight as she sorted through forgotten boxes and remnants of the life they had lived before everything changed. It was late spring, the air sweet with the smell of blooming lilacs drifting in through the cracked attic window, and there was something about the season, the rebirth, the stubborn resilience of the world pushing green through the ruins of winter that made her brave enough to open old boxes she had once avoided. Her hands, steady now in a way they hadn't been months before, brushed over a cracked cardboard lid and lifted it, revealing a stack of photo albums, their covers worn, their pages swollen slightly with age and humidity. She pulled one out at random, brushing a layer of dust from the cover, and carried it downstairs, feeling like she was holding something both precious and fragile. Jason was sitting on the couch, a book open but forgotten on his lap, his head tilted back against the cushion, the lines of weariness softer now than they had been in the bleak months following the reveal. Laura settled beside him, their shoulders brushing, and without speaking, she opened the album between them. The first photo was one she hadn't seen in years, she and Jason and the boys at the beach, the sun so bright it bleached the edges of the picture, sand clinging to their skin and laughter frozen forever in time. Jason stood behind her in the photo, his arms wrapped loosely around her waist, Mason clinging to one leg, Caleb perched on his hip, both boys squinting into the sun with mischievous grins. Laura stared at the image, her throat tightening, memories rushing in so vividly she could almost smell the salt in the air and hear the boys' squeals as they chased each other through the surf. Jason leaned forward slightly, peering over her shoulder, and then he pointed at the picture, his finger tracing the outline of their family, all bundled together, messy and imperfect and utterly theirs. "That's real," he said simply, his voice low and steady, no bitterness, no hesitation, just a quiet certainty that seemed to anchor her in place. Laura nodded, blinking back tears that gathered and blurred the page before her. "It always was," she whispered, the words trembling on her tongue but sure in her heart. They sat there for a long moment, the weight of what they had survived and what they had built pressing gently against them like the warm, familiar pressure of a worn quilt. They didn't need a piece of paper to define their family. They didn't need perfect DNA or matching bloodlines to validate the bonds that had been forged through years of scraped knees, late-night fevers, soccer games, bedtime stories, and whispered reassurances in the dark. They had something stronger than biology. They had memories. Millions of tiny, stitched-together moments that told the story of a family who chose each other, day after imperfect day. They had love, not the fragile idealized kind, but the kind tempered by hardship and forgiveness, a love that had been tested and had not broken. And now, perhaps most miraculously of all, they had forgiveness, not just from each other, but from themselves. Laura flipped the page, and there was another picture, one she didn't even remember being taken. Jason holding Mason on his shoulders while Caleb tugged at his hand, both boys covered in melted ice cream, their faces smeared and joyful. Jason chuckled softly beside her, the sound rumbling deep in his chest, and Laura smiled through the tears slipping freely down her cheeks now, letting herself feel it all, the regret, the sorrow, the gratitude, the fierce, aching love. She rested her head against Jason's shoulder, and he tilted his head slightly to rest against hers, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured and everything they had reclaimed. They were not the same people who had stood in that photo, unscarred and unknowing, but they were something better in a way. People who had faced the worst truths about themselves and each other and had chosen to stay, to forgive, to love anyway. In the soft hush of the living room, surrounded by fading photographs and the quiet symphony of a house once broken and now healing, Laura felt a kind of peace she hadn't thought possible. They were a family, not by accident, not by biology, but by choice, by love, by the stubborn, beautiful decision to believe that even after devastation, something good could grow. And for the first time in a long, long while, she truly believed that they were going to be okay. At Mason and Caleb's 8th birthday party, Jason lifted both boys onto his shoulders, one on each side, his arms straining slightly under their growing weight, but his laughter ringing out clear and bright as he spun them around in wide, dizzying circles, the late afternoon sun painting the whole backyard in warm gold. The boys shrieked with laughter, their hands clutching fistfuls of his hair and shirt, their small faces flushed with joy. And for a moment, it felt like nothing had ever cracked the foundation of their family, like everything was whole and right and exactly as it should be. Laura watched from the porch, one hand wrapped loosely around a cup of lemonade she barely remembered pouring for herself, the condensation dripping onto the worn wood planks beneath her bare feet. A bittersweet smile tugged at her lips, the kind of smile born from knowing just how much pain they had walked through to arrive at this moment, the kind of smile that carried gratitude and sorrow in equal measure. Around them, the backyard was alive with the sounds of celebration, balloons bobbing in the breeze, the rustle of paper plates piled high with cake, the chatter and laughter of friends and neighbors who had shown up to celebrate, blissfully unaware of the battles Laura and Jason had fought in private to get here. The picnic tables were littered with wrapping paper and half-eaten slices of pizza, and Mason's new skateboard leaned precariously against the fence, already scuffed from his first glorious fall. Laura let her gaze drift across the yard, taking in the ordinary magic of it all. The boys' friends racing around in superhero capes, the neighbor's toddler toddling determinedly after a runaway balloon, the old dog snoring lazily under the shade of the oak tree, and felt a fierce, aching kind of love swell in her chest. They weren't the same family they had been before the truth came out. The innocence, the easy assumptions of forever, were gone, stripped away like old paint to reveal the raw wood beneath. But maybe, just maybe, that wasn't a tragedy. Maybe they were stronger now, forged by fire instead of fantasy, bonded, not by a perfect illusion, but by a battered, stubborn choice to love each other anyway. Jason, still spinning the boys around, caught her eye over their laughing heads, and, for a brief second, everything else, the guests, the noise, the weight of the past, faded away. He winked at her, a small conspiratorial gesture so full of tenderness and understanding that it stole the breath from her lungs. Something inside Laura, something that had been splintered and shifting for what felt like forever, settled quietly into place, like a puzzle piece finally finding its home. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't cinematic. It was simple, and it was everything. She smiled back, a real smile this time, one that crinkled the corners of her eyes and loosened the knot that had lived in her chest for so long. In that glance, they both acknowledged everything that had come before, the mistakes, the heartbreak, the night spent wondering if love could survive so much breaking, and everything that had yet to come. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be scars, rough patches, moments when the ghosts of the past rattled their chains a little too loudly. But there would also be birthdays like this one, full of laughter and cake and spinning sunlight, moments stitched together by forgiveness and sheer, stubborn love. Laura set her lemonade down and stepped off the porch, her bare feet cool against the grass, walking toward the chaos of children and laughter and life that she had almost lost, but somehow, miraculously, still had. Mason spotted her first and wriggled excitedly, shouting, "Mom, look, Daddy's a horse!" Jason groaned theatrically, pretending to stumble under their weight, and Caleb giggled so hard he nearly fell off Jason's shoulder. Laura laughed, a rich, full sound that felt like breathing for the first time in a long time, and reached out her arms. "My turn," she called, and the boys squealed with delight, demanding a piggyback race. Jason set them down with exaggerated care, ruffling their hair, and Laura leaned in to kiss his cheek, a brief, feather-light brush that was both an apology and a promise. His hand found hers for a moment, squeezed gently, and then they were off, the four of them racing across the lawn, tripping over laughter and love and the beautiful, imperfect mess of their stitched, back-together life. Later that night, after the guests had left and the echoes of laughter had faded into the thick summer air, after the paper plates and crumpled napkins had been swept into garbage bags and the colorful balloons had begun to sag and tilt in the cooling breeze, Laura and Jason sat together on the porch steps, the soft creak of the old wood beneath them a familiar, comforting sound. The boys were asleep inside, collapsed into a tangle of wrapping paper, half-eaten cake, and the last remnants of a day spent chasing joy, their small bodies rising and falling with the deep, steady breath of dreamless sleep. The house was quiet now, save for the occasional chirp of crickets and the low hum of the neighbor's porch light buzzing faintly in the distance. Laura cradled a glass of wine between her palms, the stemless glass catching the faint reflection of the stars that stretched endlessly above them, a velvet canopy pinpricked with light. The night smelled of freshly cut grass, sweet frosting, and the faint lingering smoke of extinguished birthday candles, and Laura found herself breathing it all in deeply, as if trying to memorize the very texture of this moment. Jason sat beside her, close enough that their knees brushed occasionally, his own glass cradled lazily in one hand. Without a word, he reached over and took her free hand, his thumb brushing slowly over her knuckles, a small, steady motion that sent a warmth radiating through her chest. She turned her head slightly to look at him, to trace the familiar lines of his profile bathed in the soft silver of starlight, the curve of his jaw, the furrow that still lingered between his brows, the mouth that had once been so quick to smile and was learning slowly, stubbornly, to do so again. "We're not perfect," he said, his voice low and rough-edged, the kind of voice that carried not regret but acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had survived. Laura felt the truth of it settled deep in her bones, in the hollow places still tender from breaking. She leaned her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes for a moment, letting herself rest against the solidity of him, the realness of him, feeling the slow, steady rise and fall of his breathing. In that quiet, Laura thought about the splinter of doubt that had once lived inside her, that small, sharp thing that had lodged itself so deep she had almost convinced herself it wasn't there. She remembered how painful it had been to dig it out, to face the truth that had unraveled their carefully woven life, to endure the bleeding that came afterward. It had felt, for a long time, like she had destroyed everything worth loving. But sitting here now, with Jason's hand wrapped around hers and the stars spinning silently overhead, she realized that some things, some necessary things, could only grow after devastation. Healing had not been a smooth, effortless thing. It had been jagged, uneven, full of steps forward and slips backward. There had been days when she thought Jason would never look at her the same way again, days when she couldn't look at herself in the mirror without flinching. There had been arguments that left them both raw and silent, and nights spent lying awake, mere inches apart but separated by a canyon of fear. There had been counseling sessions that dredged up old wounds, unspoken resentments, grief for the life they had once imagined they had. And yet, somehow, in the rubble of all that pain, something had begun to take root, something tender and fierce and unbreakable. The healing hadn't erased what had happened. It hadn't magically rewound time or given them back the innocence they had lost, but it had given them something else, something more durable, a kind of love that was less about blind trust and more about conscious choice. A love that saw the scars and loved through them, not despite them. A love that understood that forgiveness wasn't a one-time offering, but a daily practice. A quiet, stubborn decision to stay, to hope, to try again. Laura squeezed Jason's hand gently, feeling him squeeze back, and a tear slipped down her cheek, not from sadness, but from the sheer enormity of what they had built out of the wreckage. She opened her eyes and looked up at the stars, at the vastness of it all, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she didn't feel small or lost. She felt tethered, grounded, belonging to something bigger than her mistakes. Jason shifted slightly beside her and set his wineglass down on the step with a soft clink, freeing his other hand to wrap around her shoulders, pulling her closer. She went willingly, curling into his side, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her temple. They sat there in silence, not needing words, letting the night enfold them, letting the past be what it was, a part of their story, but not its end. Laura thought about how easy it would have been to walk away, how justified either of them would have been to let go, to start over elsewhere, to run from the pain. But they hadn't. They had stayed. They had fought. They had chosen each other again and again, even when the choosing hurt. And that, she realized, was a far greater triumph than any fairy tale romance. She turned her face into Jason's shoulder and whispered so softly it was almost lost to the night, "Thank you." He pressed a kiss into her hair, his lips lingering there, and in that simple, quiet gesture, she found more love than 1,000 declarations. They weren't perfect, they never would be, but they were theirs. They were real. And sometimes, Laura thought as she closed her eyes and let the weight of the day slip from her shoulders, sometimes real was the most beautiful thing in the world. And in the quiet of that porch, surrounded by the soft breaths of sleeping boys upstairs and the steady, reassuring beat of a heart that had somehow chosen forgiveness over fury, Laura knew with a certainty that sank all the way into her bones that sometimes the hardest, ugliest truths led to the most breathtaking beginning. Not the beginnings wrapped up in glitter and fireworks that she once thought love had to be, but the kind built on cracked foundations that somehow, miraculously, held stronger because of the breaks. She thought about the long, brutal year that had brought them to this place, the sleepless nights spent wrestling her own shame, the lonely mornings filled with aching silences at the breakfast table, the therapy sessions where words felt like weapons, and healing seemed like a foreign country they would never find. She thought about Jason's face the night he left, the hollow way he had looked at her, and how impossible it had seemed that anything good could rise from that devastation. And yet here they were, a little battered, a little bruised, but still standing, still holding on. Laura had spent so long believing love was supposed to be easy, a reward you got for doing everything right, but she understood now that real love, the kind that mattered, was forged in fire. It was the choice to stay when it would be easier to leave, the choice to forgive when resentment begged you to build walls instead. It was waking up every day and saying, "I choose you," even when your heart ached and your pride screamed. It wasn't about perfection. It never had been. It was about resilience, about picking up the pieces, even the sharp one, and building something new with trembling hand, about looking at someone you had hurt and who had hurt you and saying, "Still, I stay. Still, I love." It was about the promises whispered in the dark long after the wedding vows faded, the promises made when the weight of real life pressed down and fantasy evaporated. It was about finding your way home even after the map had been burned to ash. Even after you had wandered so far you forgot which direction you had come from. Laura squeezed Jason's hand tightly, grounding herself in the simple, solid reality of his presence beside her, the steady warmth of him, the unspoken forgiveness wrapped around them like the soft blanket of night. She could hear the creak of the house settling, the faint rustle of a curtain stirred by the breeze, the comforting thud of Max's foot hitting the wall in his sleep, all the small, ordinary sounds of a life that had somehow, miraculously, kept moving forward even when she had been sure it would stop. She thought about the way Jason had held the boys that afternoon, spinning them through the air as if nothing in the world could touch them, as if love alone could keep them safe. She thought about the way he had looked at her across the yard, that wink, filled with so much tenderness it had nearly undone her. She thought about the years ahead, the birthdays and scraped knees and late-night fevers and school plays and hard conversations and inside jokes waiting for them down the winding, uncertain road of life. She thought about all the ways they would keep choosing each other, not because it was easy or simple, but but because it was real and it was worth it. And in that moment, beneath the endless stretch of stars, she realized that she was not just surviving anymore. She was living, truly living, with all the messy, glorious, heartbreaking beauty that came with it. She turned her face slightly, resting it more fully against Jason's shoulder, and whispered into the soft, listening night, "We're going to be okay." The words didn't feel forced. They didn't feel like a lie told to comfort a bleeding heart. They felt true, rooted in something deeper than hope alone. Something earned, fought for, bled for. Jason's thumb brushed lightly over the back of her hand in Andrusur, a silent promise she tucked into the most tender corners of her heart. For the first time in a long, long while, Laura truly, deeply believed it, not as a desperate wish, but as a certainty. They were not the same people they had been before. They were something stronger, something wiser. They had walked through the fire and carried the scars to prove it, but they were still here, still together, still building a life one fragile, precious day at a time. And if that wasn't the very definition of love, she didn't know what was.